Hey everybody, welcome to Key Concept 2.4. The experiences of everyday life were shaped by demographic, environmental, medical, and technological changes. In the 17th century, small holding, low productivity agricultural practices, poor transportation, and adverse weather limited and disrupted the food supply, causing periodic famines. By the 18th century, Europeans began to escape from the Malthusian imbalance between population and food supply, resulting in steady population growth. So, the first thing in order to understand this key concept, you need to understand Thomas Malthus's theories. This is in that column of You Need to Know Malthus or Malthusian theory. And essentially, according to Wikipedia, it's a school of ideas that basically describes how unchecked population growth is exponential, while the growth of the food supply was expected to be arithmetical. Look at the quote on the screen. Population when unchecked increases in a geometrical ratio. Subsistence increases only in an arithmetical ratio. And Malthus also believed that there were two checks that could then reduce the population, returning it to a more sustainable level. Remember, too much food, too big of a population would lead to famine, etc. And so these preventative checks, um, such as abstinence or delayed marriages, were one, or even restricting marriage against persons suffering poverty were perceived as defective. Um, and these positive checks, which instead led to premature death, included disease, starvation, and war, basically what was referred to as the Malthusian catastrophe. And this catastrophe, according to Malthusian theory, would return population to a more sustainable level. In general, the mid 18th century began to prove Malthusian theories were no longer valid. Instead, the agricultural revolution, plus improved transportation and more food, resulted in a great population growth. And now let's talk a little bit about this population explosion of the 18th century. A couple of common misconceptions concerning population growth include that people always married young and had large families, and that past societies were ignorant concerning birth control. And these were there were limitations on population growth up to about the year 1700. Like Malthus said, famine, epidemic, disease, war were the usual checks on growth. An example of that, the 30 Years' War reduced total German population by no less than 40%. And the bubonic plague, as we know, reduced Europe's population substantially. It really was until the late 1500s did most countries have as large of a population as it did during the 1300s as well. But during the 18th century, this new, so those were also this whole idea, the disappearance of bubonic plague, as well as others, were also reasons why this population growth occurred. Um, this new pattern of growth that emerged in the 18th century, like I said, first there were fewer deaths, primarily due to the disappearance of the plague, um, as well. And then, part of that was that there were stricter measures of quarantine of plague victims and so forth, and they drove out the black rat. Um, advances in medicine probably was significant in England. It's up here how the smallpox vaccine contributed to this demographic pattern. This is really going to be Europe-wide by the 19th century, although in the 18th century, um, it was really available pretty much mainly in England. An interesting little side note, Catherine the Great actually took the smallpox vaccine in the late 18th century when it was still risky, not really sure if it would or would not work. Anyway, um, there was also canal and road building in Western Europe, which improved transportation of food. Thus, food was no longer, an issue, and the food supply meant fewer famines and fewer epidemics. New food, we talked about this in the last review, such as the potato, was introduced. And, all of this made for a better pattern. But do keep in mind, despite the lower death rate, life was still a significant struggle. Some areas experienced overpopulation, thus reducing economic opportunity. The cities that began to develop were just brutish, nasty places as well. The rural poor suffered severe poverty, and Eastern Europe was much less prosperous than Western Europe when all was said and done. The next key concept focuses on the consumer revolution of the 18th century and how this was shaped by a new concern for privacy, encouraged the purchase of new goods for homes, and created new venues for leisure activities. So let's first talk about new concern for privacy. Um, we're going to see, basically some very basic things, like, for instance, homes were now built, to include private retreats. Generally, the downstairs, in a middle class home, the downstairs was for entertaining, the upstairs was for private family life as well. There were also new consumer goods. Probably the most important were textiles. Cottons, linens for home decor as well emerged from the textile industry. Porcelain dishes came into play during this time period. In general, the middle and upper classes just had more goods to buy. And then finally, new leisure venues. We've already talked about coffee houses, but also see the emergence of taverns as pictured on the right-hand side in this picture during the time period. And then also opera houses, theaters. And this stuff, especially the theaters and opera houses, while they emerge in the 18th century, they really become a part of city life in the late 19th century as well. Also, by the 18th century, family and private life reflected these new demographic patterns and the effects of the commercial revolution. So let's talk about some of these demographic patterns as a whole. First off, one thing, the rates of illegitimate births did increase during the 18th century. Um, Yet, with that said and done, population growth was limited by marriage patterns. So the general rule of thumb, there was premarital sex. It and although illegitimate birth rates did increase, they were not as high as could have been reflected. Generally, especially in Catholic countries, if a woman got pregnant, the couple was often very much encouraged to get married and to marry quickly. In areas where the marriage patterns were emerged a little bit later, we're going to see population growth limited and some early practice of birth control in some of the Protestant countries as well. The most popular method was natural methods and so forth, but we will see, some, especially middle and upper class, and especially Protestants, that will limit childbearing. We're also going to see a decrease in infant and child mortality rates over this time period as well. And just to give you an idea, although we're going to see a great decrease, there's still a pretty high rate as compared with today's standards. Um, Usually, as we talk about this idea, usually if a woman lived to be 45 years old, it was said that she would have averaged 6 children. And if I think it was if 30% of those children made it to adulthood, uh, that would be a pretty high, unexpected statistic as well. And as a result, during this time period, we are still going to see a decrease, but still not until the late 19th century where we see major decreases in infant and child mortality. Finally, commercial wealth increases, and as a result of that, those children that do survive generally were, especially middle and upper class families, are given more space and resources, more comforts, and a more positive view of children than previously, as this bullet point points out. Moving on, cities also offered economic opportunities, uh, which affected increasing migration from rural areas, transformed urban life, and created challenges for the new urbanites and their families. I stated earlier, the agricultural revolution led to increasing urbanization. Number one, there was more of a food supply, and increased food meant more people were free to move to the cities. Also, B, the number of landless laborers continued to increase, partially due to enclosure, partially just due to the mechanization of agriculture and the new inventions that were a result of the agricultural revolution. And early city life was rough. Traditional communal values were eroded. Um, City governments really strained to provide a healthy environment. Epidemic diseases such as cholera were rampant in many cities. Lack of sanitation, overcrowding in slums will be characteristic of 18th century cities, and this really condition will get worse before it gets better as Europe continues to industrialize in the early 19th century. Uh, Urban areas just really became very polluted, nasty places. And we'll talk about this at a later time when we do key concept, when we do period 3. And then finally, also the concentration of poor people in cities led to a greater awareness of poverty, of crime, and of prostitution as social problems, and prompted increased efforts to police marginal groups. Um, One of the enlightened thinkers, Cesare Beccaria, in Crime and Punishment, wrote how we needed to try to rehabilitate those who were criminals. And we are going to see these efforts to police, marginal groups as well. Many prostitutes had to get checked for venereal diseases. This political cartoon on the left actually shows one of the social problems. A young innocent girl being lured into a life of prostitution because of the poverty in the city in this particular cartoon. We are done with period 2. Our next review will focus on key concept 3.1.